Thank you, Michael. And it is, of course, a great pleasure for me to be able to do my bit tonight to celebrate PN Review, of which perhaps a little more later. I'm also grateful to you, for all of you here tonight, for having so manfully struggled, doubtless, with the widescreen TVs you've been lugging home on Black Friday while being pummeled by an angry crowd. So it's good to see you here too. Of course, PN Review is one of those absolutely vital conduits for the cross-traffic between new poetry and new criticism. It is essential reading, I think. It has been for many years. So great to see it having another new lease of life. But it's not another life, it's the same life which is continuing, and marvellous to see. Now, my lecture to mark this occasion is about the give and take between poetry and criticism, or the take and give. It's called the quarrel with ourselves. I want to consider that phrase, that fairly well-known statement about poetry and about the way we talk about things that include poetry. Many of you will recognise its author as being W.B. Yeats. We make out of the quarrel with others rhetoric, but of the quarrel with ourselves poetry. Unlike the rhetoricians who get a confident voice from remembering the crowd they have won or will win, we sing amid our uncertainty. And smitten even in the presence of the most high beauty by the knowledge of our solitude, our rhythm shudders. I've no idea how often the first sentence of this has been quoted over the years, but the figure must be a high one. Naturally, it's been quoted apart from its context, but pointing this out should not be taken for some game-winning production of the critical ace. If you read on, I think you'll find that what he really means is this, and not what you're saying at all. Nevertheless, I will begin what I have to say with some information. Yeats's remarks come from his short prose book, Per Amica Silentia Lunae, which was written in 1917 and published simultaneously in London and New York on the 18th of January 1918. To translate those dates into the author's age, the work was written when Yeats was 51 and published when he was 52 years old. He'd been publishing poetry since he was 19 years of age and critical prose since he was 21. So his statement here has a good deal of time and experience behind it. Yeats, by this time, knew a few things, that is to say, about both poetry and quarrelling. Definitions of poetry are not very helpful things. At least, they're not at all helpful for the making of poetry. It won't help a poet to do a good job if she or he prepares to welcome the muse by reciting the mantras that poetry is at bottom a criticism of life, or that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. The reason for this is that any definition we care to provide is by its nature a nugget of critical thought and expression. And this goes for those pieces of critical theory masquerading as verse, such as the dogma that a poem should not mean but be. Hope you heard the line break there. Or many of the grander pronouncements in, say, the poems of Wallace Stevens. Wheelbarrows and plums, too, have been critically wheeled out and savoured, perhaps too much. Thinking we know what poetry is does not give us a way to write a poem, or to commit the contemporary critical sin of value judgment. It does not guarantee a good one. None of this is to deny that it's the business of critics to say, if they're lucky, to say memorably what they think poetry is. Implicitly, all worthwhile poetry criticism does this, however incrementally or subtly. But between critical thought and the ways in which the mechanisms of an achieved poem can be said to enact a kind of thought, there is a real and insuperable distinction. Distinctions can be blurred, of course, but a blurred distinction is simply one that is rendered unclear, not one that has been abolished. Criticism, like poetry, ought to be in the business of clarity. Good criticism makes clear what was otherwise indistinct, while a good poem puts something hitherto not merely indistinct but entirely non-existent into its own unique clarity of existence. Criticism necessarily talks in terms of things we know about, in however intellectually demanding a way. A really new poem, on the other hand, is something we never knew before, and which we had no means of imagining. Put like that, it might be difficult to see where any difficulties could possibly arise. Poems are poems, and criticism is criticism, and all is well. And yet, as Yeats and others in other times have known, the world is not like this. For both poetry and criticism have inherent tendencies to know what is best for each other. At its worst, that can result in the kind of poetry that disdains all possible readers in the name of its own unchallengeable authenticity, demanding only a criticism that has already passed the test of appreciating it. And the sort of criticism which either knows in advance what does and does not make a good poem, or then proceeds to assess poets and subjects in accordance with standards it insists upon as normative. Not that Yeats, you'll notice, says anything about criticism. Instead, he mentions the quarrel with others. And this goes further than mere disagreement on literary judgments. What is a quarrel? The OED offers two definitions which seem to cover Yeats's intended ground. It's 3a which first occurs to us, perhaps, a dispute or argument, a violent contention or altercation with another person or between persons, a disruption of friendly relations. This itself spans a good deal, for a disruption of friendly relations is one thing, and a violent contention quite another. There's also sense 2a to consider, a ground or occasion of complaint with, also against or to, a person, leading to hostile feeling, words or action, a reason for having or cause of unfriendly or unfavourable feelings towards another person, a state or feeling of hostility resulting from any such cause, in recent use, influenced by sense 3a and used especially in negative contexts, frequently as object of, to have. This catches a lot of what the quarrel with others, as Yeats puts it, might mean. But how far does any of it answer to what Yeats calls the quarrel with ourselves? It may be that the word here straddles two quite different kinds of disagreement, or two distinct fields of combative engagement. But the main force of Yeats's use of quarrel is one of surprise. Surprise that a word from the aggressive contentions of a public arena should be applied to something as apparently inward-looking as poetry, and to something as seemingly private as the self. Inclined as Yeats may have been to view himself later as one of the last romantics, there's little that's conventionally romantic about this. The feel of Wordsworth's definition of poetry as emotion recollected in tranquility is far from the kind of turmoil envisaged here. It's far, too, from what passes for the truth now, almost a century after Yeats made his formulation. so much so that it's entirely plausible in contemporary poetic and critical culture to replace quarrel with the word agreement. Nowadays, we make out of the agreement with others rhetoric, but of the agreement with ourselves poetry. Most of what I want to say at present concerns poetry, but that will have to be said in the medium of critical prose, of rhetoric, if you like. And so it may be useful to cast a glance at the kind of writing that concerns itself critically with poetry. Here, I think, agreement is the common currency. Not only is there an underlying consensus about fundamental things, but even a consensus about the positive value of consensus itself. Partly that can be accounted for by the enormous changes which affected critical discussion through the 20th century, the most significant of those being the emergence of professional academic criticism, that vast acreage of words published to be consumed in passing by a few assessors and dispensers of patronage, and destined to lose even this tiny audience in a very short time. Here, while there may be 100 methods of jockeying for position, along with the wholly honourable presentation of genuinely new information, there's really little room for any thoroughgoing rejection of what is taken for granted by those who have themselves the power to grant things. Any powerful consensus does not feel the need to formulate itself, and the more powerful it is, the less need there will be. Perhaps even so, the dimensions of a consensus in contemporary criticism may be estimated with reference to what's now plainly beyond the pale. Take, for example, T.S. Eliot's definition of criticism, made in 1923, as, roughly speaking, the elucidation of works of art and the correction of taste. One test of that in our contemporary conditions would be to ask whether it would or would not be regarded as fit to publish in an academic context. The red pencils of how many peer reviewers would hover over it, ready to strike. The statement in itself would be seen generally as objectionable, because clearly spoiling for a fight, and the key terms would be exposed as either false or out of date. In the large field of endeavour that identifies itself as humanities, for instance, an unself-conscious belief in things called works of art would be understood as a sign of, at best, undereducated naivety. Elucidation would be marked down as something epistemologically far too sure of itself, and taste identified as a category insufficiently historicised or theorised. While any notion of correction would be enough to consign the piece to the netherworld of outright rejection. Who, it might be asked, appealing implicitly to the consensus of upright fellow members of the Guild, does the author of such remarks think he is? Actually, the T.S. Eliot of 1923 was trying to stir things up and hoping for a productive degree of unacceptability even then. And his essay, which bore the archly neo-Arnoldian title of The Function of Criticism, affected to disdain the ruck of raised and squabbling voices floating above them like a sublimely untroubled hot air balloon. This is Eliot. But on giving the matter a little attention, we perceive that criticism, far from being a simple and orderly field of beneficent activity from which impostors can be readily ejected, is no better than a Sunday park of contending and contentious orators who have not even arrived at the articulation of their differences. Here, one would suppose, was a place for quiet cooperative labour,